The wind in this part of the West had a language all its own. It was a dry, rasping tongue that spoke of endless horizons and forgotten graves. It scoured the land, peeling paint from the hopeful facades of the town of redemption and worrying the loose timbers of the shack Eliza called home. Home was a generous word for the structure. It was more a husk, a collection of sun-bleached planks clinging to a desperate frame at the edge of the known world, where the prairie surrendered to the unforgiving badlands. It had been 6 months since the Cunninghams had cast her out. 6 months since the door to the modest farmhouse she had shared with her late husband, Thomas, had been bolted against her. It's what's proper. Her father-in-law, a man whose piety was as hard and unyielding as the winter ground, had declared. Her mother-in-law had simply turned away, her face a mask of pinched grief that had no room for a daughter-in-law who was now little more than a burden. A widow was a loose thread in the tight weave of their world, and they had snipped it clean. So Eliza, at 22, found herself alone. Thomas had been a good man, a gentle farmer taken by a fever that burned through him in 3 short days, leaving behind nothing but a hollowness in her chest and the scent of him on a pillow she could not bring herself to wash. His family had given her a pittance, a few coins that felt more like an insult than charity, and pointed her toward the horizon. The shack had been abandoned for years, and it was hers for the simple price of living where no one else would. Life here was a constant, grinding battle. The dust was a living entity, a fine red powder that worked its way through every crack, coating her throat, her food, the very pages of the Bible she read by the faint light of a tallow candle. Water was a daily pilgrimage. The creek was a half-mile walk, and she carried 2 heavy buckets back each morning, her shoulders aching, the precious liquid sloshing with every weary step. At night, the coyotes would sing their lonesome, chilling chorus, a sound that reminded her of her own profound solitude. She was a woman alone, an anomaly as stark and vulnerable as a solitary cottonwood in a lightning storm. The people of Redemption treated her as such, on her infrequent trips to town for supplies. She felt their eyes on her like a physical touch. The women, clustered outside the general store in their calico dresses, would fall silent as she passed, their whispers resuming like the rustle of dried leaves in her wake. They saw a threat, or perhaps a tragedy they feared was contagious. A woman without a man was an untethered thing, and in their world, everything had to be tied down. The men were different. Their stares were heavier, laced with a coarse curiosity. They saw not a grieving widow, but an opportunity. A few had tried their luck, a ranch hand offering to fix her leaky roof with a sly wink, a drunken prospector slurring a crude invitation outside the saloon. Eliza had learned to build a fortress of propriety around herself. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, her bonnet pulled low, her answers to any inquiry clipped and impersonal. Her needle was her only true companion, and her shield. She took in mending and sewing, her fingers often raw from pushing the needle through coarse denim and stiff canvas. She turned collars, patched trousers, and sewed neat, tiny stitches into the baptismal gowns of babies she would never hold. It was meager work, barely enough to afford flour, salt pork, and the occasional luxury of a stick of cinnamon. But it was honest. It was hers. And it kept her from having to ask for anything, from anyone. Pride was the one thing the Cunninghams hadn't been able to take from her, and she guarded it fiercely. On this particular day, the sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue. She had delivered a set of freshly laundered and mended shirts to Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, and collected her small payment. The air was thick and still, heavy with an unspoken promise. By the time she had loaded her small buckboard with her meager provisions, the horizon had bruised to a deep, angry purple. The wind began to stir, not with its usual dry rasp, but with a low, mournful moan that raised the hairs on her arms. She urged her old mare, patience, onward. The cart rattled and swayed on the rutted track. the wheels groaning in protest. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, hitting the parched earth with a sizzle and releasing the rich, loamy scent of a coming storm. Then, the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain, but a deluge, a solid sheet of water that blurred the landscape into a gray, featureless misery. The wind howled, tearing at her bonnet and whipping her thin shawl around her. Patience, normally so placid, grew skittish. She shied as a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in a stark, ghostly white for a heartbeat. The thunder that followed was a physical blow, a crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Eliza held the reins tight, her knuckles white, murmuring soothing words that were stolen by the gale before they could reach the mare's ears. They were less than a mile from her shack when it happened. The right wheel of the buckboard plunged into a deep, rain-filled rut that she hadn't seen in the gloom. The cart lurched violently, a sickening crack of splintering wood echoing under the roar of the storm. Eliza was thrown, a cry torn from her lips as she landed hard on the muddy ground. A sharp, searing pain shot up from her ankle, and the world tilted, darkness encroaching on the edges of her vision. She tried to push herself up, but her ankle buckled, sending another wave of agony through her. The rain plastered her hair to her face, cold and relentless. Patience, freed from the broken harness, whinnied in terror and bolted into the storm. "No," Eliza whispered, the word a faint puff of air. "Patience, come back." But the mare was gone. Eliza was alone, injured, with the cold seeping into her bones. She began to crawl, dragging her useless leg through the mud, her small bag of flour and salt pork. Her only thought, she had to get it home. She had to get home. But the shack was an impossible distance away, and her strength was fading with every agonizing movement. The world became a swirl of rain, pain, and a terrifying, encroaching numbness. She was so cold, so tired. Her head fell forward onto the wet earth, and the roar of the storm dissolved into a profound, welcome silence. Luke Calder had been checking his fence line when the storm hit. He'd lost a calf to a coyote last week and wasn't about to lose another because of a rotted post. He was a man accustomed to the solitude and the violence of the land. It had been 3 years since Mary had succumbed to the lung fever. 3 winters he'd faced alone in the sturdy ranch house he had built for her with his own 2 hands. The silence in that house was a different kind of silence than the quiet of the prairie. It was a hollow, echoing thing, filled with the ghosts of laughter and soft words. He worked from sunup to sundown to keep from hearing it. He was riding back to the barn, his oilskin slicker doing little to keep out the driving rain, when his horse, Zeus, suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward. Luke squinted through the downpour. At first, he saw only the wrecked buckboard, its one wheel pointing accusingly at the sky, a common enough sight after a squall. But then he saw the small, dark shape in the mud beside it. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mire. As he drew closer, he realized it was a woman. Her face was pale as milk, her lips tinged with blue. He knelt, his movements economical and sure. He felt for a pulse at her neck, relieved to find a faint, thready beat. He recognized her then, the quiet widow from the edge of town, the one with the downcast eyes who always seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. Gently, he brushed the wet hair from her face. She was younger than he'd thought. Her ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, already beginning to swell. With a low grunt, he carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile, sodden bundle. She stirred, moaning softly, but didn't wake. Holding her securely against his chest, he remounted Zeus and urged the powerful horse toward the distant, welcoming light of his own home. Eliza woke slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. The first thing she registered was warmth, a gentle, pervasive heat that seemed to soak into her chilled bones, The second was the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. The third was the impossible softness beneath her. A real mattress. A thick wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Her eyes fluttered open. She was in a room she did not know. The walls were made of sturdy, well-fitted logs, the ceiling high and beamed. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth across the room, casting dancing shadows on the wood. A man's coat was slung over a chair. A pair of worn leather boots stood by the fire. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She tried to sit up, but a bolt of pain from her ankles sent her gasping back against the pillows. She clutched the blanket tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. A figure moved in the corner of her eye, and she flinched. A man rose from a chair where he'd been sitting in the shadows. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind. His hair was the color of dark wheat, and his eyes, as he stepped into the firelight, were a startling, clear gray. It was the lone rancher, the man whose property bordered the creek. She'd seen him from a distance before, a solitary figure moving across the vast landscape. But they had never spoken. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low and calm, a stark contrast to the storm that still raged outside. "You took a bad fall. Found you by your cart." Eliza stared at him, her mind racing. She was in a strange man's house. In his bed, her clothes, her wet, muddy dress was gone, replaced by a soft, oversized flannel shirt that smelled faintly of soap and pine. A blush crept up her neck, hot and fierce. Where are my things?" she stammered, her voice a hoarse whisper. He gestured with his chin toward the fire. "Your dress is drying. It was soaked through. You would have caught your death." He kept a respectful distance, his hands held loosely at his sides. He wasn't threatening, but the situation itself was a violation of every rule she lived by. "I must go," she said, trying to push herself up again, ignoring the throbbing in her ankle. "You'll do no such thing," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Your ankle is likely broken, and that storm's not letting up any time soon. You're safe here, ma'am." The word ma'am was a small courtesy, but it did little to soothe her frayed nerves. To be here, under his roof, dependent on his charity, it was a humiliation. It was a danger. Gossip and redemption spread faster than prairie fire. "I cannot stay," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "It wouldn't be proper." A flicker of something, understanding, perhaps even sadness, crossed his face. "Proper seems a small thing to worry about when you're half frozen in a mud puddle. Just rest. I'll not bother you." He turned and went to the hearth, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. The savory smell of beef and barley stew filled the small room. He brought it over, setting it on a small table beside the bed, along with a cup of steaming coffee. "You need to eat," he said simply. Eliza shook her head, turning her face away. "I'm not hungry." The man, Luke, let out a soft sigh. He didn't press. He just pulled the chair a little closer to the fire and sat down, watching the flames. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof. He seemed content to wait, a man carved from the same patient, enduring material as the land itself. Finally, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach won out over her pride. Her resolve crumbled, slowly, hesitantly. She reached for the bowl. The stew was hot, rich, and more delicious than anything she had tasted in months. He said nothing, did not even look at her, granting her the dignity of pretending he didn't notice her surrender. As she ate, a measure of the warmth returned to her body, and with it, a profound, bone-deep weariness. She was too weak to fight, too weak to leave. For now, against every instinct, she was trapped in the quiet, gentle care of the cowboy. The following days unfolded in a slow, quiet rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the steady, throbbing ache in Eliza's ankle. Luke had been right. The storm had raged for another full day. imprisoning them in the small, warm cabin. He had fashioned a crude but effective splint for her ankle from 2 flat pieces of wood and strips of clean linen, his hands surprisingly gentle and sure. He insisted she stay in the bed, which she soon learned was his own, while he made his own bedroll on the floor by the hearth. This simple act of chivalry embarrassed her as much as it relieved her. She remained a fortress of reserved politeness. Every time he brought her a plate of food, simple fare of bacon, beans, and fresh-baked bread that was surprisingly light, she would thank him with a clipped, formal tone. "You are too kind. Mr. Calder," she would say. Keeping her eyes fixed on the plate, he would simply nod, his gray eyes betraying nothing, and retreat to his own side of the room. The distance she tried to enforce felt both necessary and absurd in the small, intimate space. She was acutely aware of him, the quiet tread of his boots on the wooden floor, the way he would hunch over a piece of leather he was mending, the low murmur as he spoke to his dog, a scruffy shepherd mix named Gus who had accepted Eliza's presence with a curious sniff and a friendly tail wag. She was a guest in the most private corners of his life. Yet she clung to the pretense that they were strangers who had merely been thrown together by circumstance. When the sun finally broke through the clouds on the 3rd day, it illuminated the world Luke had built. From her vantage point in the bed, she could see out the single, clean window. His ranch was not large, but it was a testament to order and hard work in a world that constantly threatened to fall into chaos. The log cabin was sturdy, the chinking between the logs neat and tight. A well-kept barn stood a short distance away, its wood weathered to a soft silver. A small corral held 2 sturdy horses that watched the world with placid eyes. But it was the garden that surprised her. Beside the cabin, enclosed by a neat picket fence to keep out deer and rabbits, was a small plot of land bursting with life. There were rows of beans, squash, and corn, and a patch of hardy-looking tomato vines. In the center was a profusion of wildflowers, prairie rose and Indian paintbrush, a splash of vibrant, defiant color against the endless sea of brown and green grasses that stretched to the horizon. It was a woman's touch, she thought, and a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar went through her. This was a place built for 2. The landscape itself was a character in their silent play. It was a place of breathtaking, brutal beauty. In the mornings, the prairie was awash in a soft, golden light. The distant mesas painted in shades of lavender and rose, but by midday, the sun was a merciless hammer, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy white and baking the earth until it cracked. The wind was a constant companion, sometimes a gentle whisper through the tall grass, other times a raw, howling force that rattled the window panes and seemed to carry the loneliness of the entire continent with it. It was a land that gave nothing easily. To survive here, one had to be as tough and resilient as the gnarled junipers that clung to the rocky outcrops. Luke Calder, she realized, was a man who had been shaped by this land. He was quiet, enduring, and self-sufficient. On the 4th day, she felt strong enough to move. Luke whittled a crude crutch for her from a sturdy branch, and she hobbled out onto the porch, blinking in the bright sunlight. The air was clean, washed by the storm, and carried the scent of sage and damp earth. Luke was in the corral, speaking in low tones to one of his horses, his hand stroking the animal's powerful neck. He moved with an easy, unhurried grace that she found herself watching, a flush creeping up her cheeks when he turned and saw her. He walked over, wiping his hands on his denim trousers. "Feeling better?" "Yes, thank you," she said, her eyes on the distant horizon. "I've imposed on you for too long. I must find a way back to my home." "Your cart's a wreck," he said bluntly. "Axles snapped clean, and you're not walking on that ankle for another week at least." He squinted at her. "There's no imposition. Mrs. Cunningham. It's good to have the company." The words were spoken so plainly, without any hint of artifice, that she didn't know how to respond. Thomas had been the only man she had ever truly known, and their conversations had been filled with the comfortable familiarity of shared lives. This man was a stranger, yet his presence was becoming a strange kind of comfort. To pass the long hours, she insisted on helping. She sat on a stool on the porch, shelling beans from his garden into a large clay bowl, her fingers falling into the familiar, repetitive rhythm. He worked nearby, repairing a harness, the scent of leather and his quiet industry filling the air between them. They rarely spoke, but the silence was no longer tense. It was a shared quiet, a space where words were not needed. One afternoon, as the sun began its long descent, casting long shadows across the prairie, he finally spoke of it. He was looking at the patch of wildflowers in the garden. "Mary planted those," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "She said a place wasn't a home without something that was beautiful for no reason." Eliza kept her eyes on the beans in her lap, her hands stilling. "Mary?" "My wife," he confirmed. He picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in his calloused fingers. "We came out here 7 years ago, full of plans. This was going to be the finest ranch in the territory." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "The land had other ideas, but we were happy." He paused, and Eliza held her breath, knowing she was treading on sacred ground. "It was the 3rd winter," he continued, his voice low and even, as if reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. "The lung fever came on fast. The snow was so deep. I couldn't get to town for the doctor. I did what I could, but it wasn't enough." He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic exterior to the profound, aching grief that lived within him. "She died right there, in that bed you're sleeping in. I've been alone since." A knot formed in Eliza's throat. She thought of Thomas, of the fever that had consumed him, of the terrifying helplessness she had felt watching the life fade from his eyes. The chasm of propriety and strangeness that had separated them suddenly vanished, replaced by a bridge of shared loss. "My husband, his name was Thomas," she whispered, the words feeling rusty in her throat. "It was a fever, too, last spring." Luke nodded slowly. He didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. He simply met her gaze and acknowledged their shared membership in a club no one ever wished to join. In that moment of silent understanding, something shifted between them. He was no longer just Mr. Calder, the cowboy who had rescued her. He was Luke, a man who knew the shape of her own sorrow. The quiet afternoons continued, but they were different now. The conversations were still sparse, but they were filled with an unspoken meaning. He would ask about the farm she had shared with Thomas, and she would tell him about their small herd of dairy cows. She would ask about his cattle, and he would explain the challenges of finding enough grazing land in the dry season. They were mapping the territories of their past lives, 2 lonely cartographers finding common ground. But with this new, fragile intimacy came a new kind of fear. Eliza felt herself softening, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. She would catch herself watching him, admiring the strength in his arms as he chopped wood, or the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to his dog. And the realization terrified her. She was a widow. Her heart belonged to Thomas, to his memory. To feel anything for another man felt like a betrayal. The night it happened, the moon was a sliver of silver in an ink-black sky. The prairie was alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful cry of a lone coyote. Eliza had been asleep for hours, lost in the heavy, dreamless slumber of exhaustion. But then, the dream came for her. She was back in the small farmhouse, the air thick with the scent of sickness and herbal remedies. Thomas was in their bed, his face pale and slick with sweat, his breathing a shallow, ragged sound. She was holding his hand, feeling it grow colder and colder, his grip weakening. Then the dream shifted, and it was her father-in-law's face looming over her, his eyes cold as stones. "You are nothing now," he hissed, his voice echoing in the empty room. "A barren widow, a burden." He was pointing toward the door, toward the darkness, and she was stumbling out into a cold, merciless wind. A sound, half sob, half scream, tore itself from her throat, and she woke with a gasp, her body rigid, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to glowing embers. She was tangled in the blankets, the phantom chill of the dream still clinging to her skin. A floorboard creaked. Luke was standing by the hearth, a silhouette against the dying coals. He had been woken by her cry. "A bad dream?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She couldn't speak, only nod, pulling the blankets tighter around her, as if they could shield her from the memory, and from him. He moved toward the bed, his steps slow and deliberate. He didn't light a lamp. He simply pulled up the small wooden chair and sat beside her, a few feet away, a silent, steady presence in the dark. "It's just the wind," he said softly. "It plays tricks on you out here." But it wasn't the wind. It was the raw, gaping wound of her grief and humiliation, torn open once again. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and shameful. She would not cry in front of him. She would not. He seemed to sense her turmoil. He didn't speak again, just sat there, his presence a quiet anchor in the terrifying darkness of her mind. Minutes stretched by. The frantic beating of her heart began to slow, but his proximity was a different kind of storm. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint scent of wood smoke and clean earth that clung to him. He was so close, too close. The fear, sharp and instinctive, returned. The fear of what the town would say, the fear of what she was feeling, the fear of betraying the man she had loved. Her whole body tensed. She clutched the thick wool blanket and pulled it up to her chin, a desperate, flimsy barrier. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a raw, panicked whisper, aimed at the darkness, at him, at herself. "I've never shared a bed," she said, the words tumbling out, heavy with a meaning he couldn't possibly understand. "Not with anyone. Not since he died." It was a declaration, a plea, a desperate drawing of a line in the sand. This far, and no further. My grief is all I have left. My fidelity is my last possession. Luke was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her in the darkness, and she braced herself for his response, for him to retreat, offended, or worse, to misunderstand. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low, so gentle, it was almost part of the wind whispering outside. "I don't need the bed," he said softly. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. He wasn't challenging her or correcting her. He was accepting her boundary, and then gently, incredibly, offering something more. He leaned forward slightly, and she could just make out the earnest set of his jaw in the faint glow of the embers. "But if you'd share your heart," he paused, the words heavy with a quiet plea. "Do that, if only for a night." Luke's words lingered in the quiet darkness long after he had spoken them, more potent than a touch, more intimate than a kiss. Share your heart, if only for a night. He was not asking for her body, but for something far more guarded, far more fragile. He was asking for the truth of her sorrow. After a long, suspended silence, he had risen from the chair, given a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and returned to his bedroll by the fire, leaving her in the echoing quiet with the weight of his offer. 2 days later, her ankle was strong enough to bear her weight with the help of the crutch. The decision to leave felt like tearing a piece of herself away. Luke did not argue. He simply hitched his spare horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, to a small wagon, and loaded the remnants of Eliza's buckboard onto it. He also added a sack of potatoes, a slab of bacon, and a jar of his late wife's preserved peaches. "For your trouble," he said, avoiding her eyes. "You will take no payment, Mr. Calder," Eliza said, her voice stiff with a practiced formality that felt flimsy and false. "I am already in your debt." "It's not payment," he replied, his gaze finally meeting hers. "It's just neighborly. Folks out here have to look out for one another." The word neighborly struck her as both true and a profound understatement. The journey back to her shack was a silent one. He drove the wagon, his broad back to her, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. When they arrived, the shack looked smaller, more pathetic than she remembered. The wind whistled through the same cracks in the walls, but now the sound seemed lonelier, colder. After the solid, warm security of Luke's cabin, her home felt like a derelict ship tossed on a sea of grass. He helped her down, his hand firm and warm on her arm, a touch she felt long after he had let go. He carried her meager supplies inside, his large frame seeming to fill the entire tiny room. He looked around at the sparse furnishings, the patched quilt on her narrow cot, the neat stack of mending by the cold hearth. His expression was unreadable. "You'll let me know if you need anything," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm quite self-sufficient, thank you," she replied, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. He nodded, his jaw tight. He lingered at the doorway for a moment, as if wanting to say more, but then he simply turned and left. Eliza stood by her small, grimy window and watched him ride away, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, indifferent horizon until he was gone. The loneliness that rushed in to fill the space was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. For 5 days, she had not been truly alone, and she hadn't realized until this moment how much she had come to depend on his quiet presence. She tried to slip back into her old life, into the fortress of routine she had built. She mended, she cleaned, she made the long walk to the creek for water, but everything was changed. Her mind was a traitor, constantly replaying the quiet moments on his porch, the low timbre of his voice, the look of shared grief in his eyes. His words from the night of her dream were a constant refrain, a question that haunted her waking hours and whispered to her in her sleep. What did it mean to share a heart? A week after her return, she had to go to Redemption for thread and flour. The walk was long, and her ankles still ached with a dull throb. As she stepped onto the dusty main street, she felt the familiar chill of scrutiny, but this time, it was different. The whispers seemed louder, the glances sharper, more knowing. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, saw her from across the street and gave her a look of such frosty condemnation that Eliza felt her cheeks burn with shame. News, she knew, traveled fast in the West, carried on the wind from one isolated homestead to another. Her disappearance during the storm and her reappearance in Luke Calder's wagon had not gone unnoticed. It was then that Jebediah Stone chose to make his move. Jeb was a freight hauler, a big man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes. He had been watching Eliza for months, his gaze a greasy slick she could feel on her skin. He saw a vulnerable widow with no man to protect her, a piece of property without a claim. He cornered her as she was leaving the general store, stepping in front of her to block her path. He reeked of whiskey and cheap cigars. "Well now, Mrs. Cunningham," he boomed, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Heard you had a bit of an accident. Good thing that Hermit Calder was around to lend a hand." He gave the words a lewd emphasis that made Eliza's stomach clench. "Excuse me, Mr. Stone," she said, trying to step around him. He moved with her, blocking her again. "No need to be in such a hurry. A pretty little thing like you shouldn't be living all alone out there. It ain't safe." He leaned closer. "I could offer you some protection. A woman has needs, after all." His meaning was as clear as it was repulsive. Eliza's face went pale. "I require no protection. Now, if you'll please step aside." His grin vanished. "Don't get proud with me. Widow, you're in no position to be proud." He reached out and grabbed her arm. his fingers digging into her flesh. "You just think about my offer." Fear, cold and sickening, washed over her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like an iron band. "Let go of me." "I'll let go when I'm good and ready." "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." The voice was low, calm, and as solid as bedrock. Both Eliza and Jeb turned. Luke Calder was standing there, not 10 feet away. He had a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, and his face was set like granite. He must have just ridden into town. Jeb Stone's eyes narrowed. He was a head taller than Luke and outweighed him by a good 50 pounds. He sneered, not releasing his grip on Eliza. "This ain't none of your concern. Calder, this is a private conversation between me and the lady." "Her arm says it's not a conversation," Luke said, his voice dropping even lower. "Take your hand off her, now." For a moment, the whole street seemed to fall silent. A few townspeople stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Jeb, emboldened by his audience, laughed. "Or what? You gonna go running back to your lonely little shack in the hills?" That was a mistake. Luke closed the distance in 2 quick strides. He didn't say another word. He simply grabbed Jeb's wrist and applied a sharp, twisting pressure, with a yelp of pain and surprise. Jeb's fingers flew open, releasing Eliza. Eliza stumbled back, cradling her arm, her heart hammering. Jeb, his face turning a blotchy red with fury and humiliation, swung a clumsy, powerful fist at Luke's head. Luke ducked under the blow and drove his own fist into Jeb's soft middle. The air went out of the bigger man with a loud whoosh. Luke followed it with a hard right cross that caught Jeb squarely on the jaw. The crack of knuckles on bone was a sickeningly loud sound in the sudden quiet. Jebediah Stone staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then his legs gave out. He collapsed in a heap in the dusty street, groaning. The fight was over before it had truly begun. It was brutally efficient, devoid of any fanfare. Luke stood over him for a second, breathing a little heavily. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked down at the man, his expression a mask of cold fury, then turned his attention to Eliza. The anger in his eyes was replaced instantly with concern. "Are you all right?" But Eliza barely heard him. All she could see were the faces of the onlookers, Mrs. Gable with her mouth agape in scandalized horror, the men outside the saloon now openly staring, the women whispering furiously behind their hands. She had spent months making herself invisible, and in less than a minute, Luke had made her the center of the most scandalous spectacle Redemption had seen in years. Humiliation and a hot, irrational anger surged through her. "Why did you do that?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "I could have handled it." Luke looked taken aback. "He had his hands on you." "And now the entire town has its eyes on me," she cried, her voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Without another word, she turned and fled, half walking, half running down the street, ignoring the throbbing in her ankle, ignoring Luke's call of her name. All she wanted was to escape, to hide, to disappear. The gossip was even worse than she had imagined. The story twisted and grew with every telling. She was no longer just the quiet widow. She was the troublemaking widow, a woman who pitted men against each other. Luke was the wild cowboy, coming down from the hills to brawl in the street over a woman of questionable character. They were a scandal, a matched pair of outsiders disrupting the town's fragile peace. Her few sewing customers suddenly had no more mending for her. The silence when she entered the general store was now absolute and hostile. She was angrier at Luke than she had ever been at anyone. He had meant to help, but he had instead put a target on her back. He had confirmed everyone's worst assumptions about a woman living alone. Yet, deep beneath the fury, a secret, shameful warmth spread through her. No one had ever stood up for her like that, not even Thomas, whose gentle nature would have shied away from any confrontation. In that moment, when Luke had stepped between her and Jeb Stone, she had felt something she hadn't felt since her husband's death, safe, and the gratitude she felt was so potent it frightened her. 2 evenings later, there was a knock at her door. Her heart leaped into her throat, thinking it was Luke, but when she opened it, there was no one there. On the worn wooden step sat a small, neatly wrapped parcel. Her name was written on it in a strong, simple hand she recognized from a list of supplies she had seen on his kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she brought it inside and unwrapped it. It was not a gift of food or some practical item. Inside the brown paper was a man's handkerchief. It was made of fine, soft linen, yellowed with age, and in one corner, embroidered with a delicate, faded bloom. Mary's. It was his wife's handkerchief. There was no note. None was needed. It was a message of pure, unadorned sympathy. He had seen her distress, her fear, her tears held back by a dam of pride. He had not come to argue or to defend himself. He had simply sent a piece of his own history, his own grief, to acknowledge hers. It was an offering of comfort, a silent apology, and a profound gesture of understanding that shattered her defenses completely. Eliza sank onto her cot, the small square of linen clutched in her hand. She brought it to her face. It smelled faintly of dried lavender and cedar. For months, she had not allowed herself to truly cry. She had borne her husband's death, her in-laws' cruelty, her poverty, and her loneliness with a stoic, tearless resolve. Crying was a luxury she could not afford, an indulgence that would only leave her weaker. But this simple, tender gesture from a man who understood loss broke the dam. That night, she stood outside her shack, the handkerchief pressed to her cheek, and looked up at the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky. And for the first time since Thomas had died, she wept. She cried for her lost husband, for the life they would never have. She cried for her own aching loneliness. And as the silent, hot tears streamed down her face, she finally admitted the terrifying, undeniable truth to the unblinking moon. She was crying because she was falling in love with Luke Calder, and she had no idea what to do. The catharsis of tears left Eliza feeling hollowed out and strangely calm. For months, she had been a ship holding tight to its anchor in a storm, believing that to let go was to be dashed upon the rocks. But the storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, she found that the anchor of her stoic grief had been keeping her from finding a new shore. Luke's simple, profound act of empathy had not been a rock, but a lighthouse, and its beam pointed toward a life she had been too afraid to even imagine. Fear did not simply vanish, but it was now matched by a new, more powerful force, a deep, resonant longing. The loneliness of her shack became unbearable. The wind whispering through the cracks no longer sounded like a lament. It sounded like Luke's name, the memory of his quiet presence, the steady calm in his gray eyes, the way he had stood between her and Jeb Stone. These things became the landscape of her thoughts. She knew she could not wait for fate to intervene again. The town had already passed its judgment, casting her and Luke as co-conspirators in a shared scandal, if she was to be condemned. She decided with a flicker of the defiance she thought she had lost. It would be for a truth she chose, not a lie they had invented. Her excuse, when she finally found the courage, was practical and thin as a worn-out sheet. But it was the only armor she had. She packed a small bundle of her finest needles, spools of sturdy thread, and a pair of sharp shears. With her sewing basket in hand and Mary's handkerchief tucked safely in her pocket, she made the long walk to his ranch. Her heart hammered a nervous rhythm against her ribs with every step. What if he turned her away? What if he had regretted his kindness, his moment of vulnerability? She found him by the corral, replacing a rotted post. He was driving a new one into the hard-packed earth with a heavy sledgehammer, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling and releasing with each powerful swing. He stopped when he saw her approaching. Leaning the sledgehammer against the fence, he wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his expression guarded. Eliza's courage faltered. She clutched her basket a little tighter. "Mr. Calder," she began, her voice sounding small in the vast, open space. "It's Luke," he said, his voice flat. She swallowed. "Luke, I came to ask if you had any work." At his questioning look, she hurried on, the words tumbling out. "Mending shirts, trousers, harnesses. My business in town has dwindled. I need to earn my keep. And I thought perhaps you might have need of a seamstress." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the buzzing of a fly and the whisper of the wind. She watched a storm of emotions cross his face, surprise, confusion, and then a slow, dawning understanding. He saw her excuse for what it was, a flag of truce, an offering. A small, tentative smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I've got a stack of denim that's seen better days," he said, his voice softer now, "and the straps on my saddlebags are about to give. I'd be grateful for the help. Eliza." The sound of her own name on his lips was as startling and welcome as rain in a drought. And so began a new chapter. Eliza did not move into his home. That would have been a step too far, a confirmation of the town's ugliest rumors. Instead, she would walk to his ranch in the early morning and leave before dusk, creating a strange, suspended world for the two of them. A world that existed only between sunup and sundown on his isolated patch of land. At first, she stuck to her sewing, sitting on the porch while he went about his work. But soon, the lines of their labor began to blur. He came in for his midday meal one day to find she had not only mended his shirts, but also prepared a pot of savory stew and a pan of fresh cornbread. She had found his wife's old recipe book, its pages soft and stained with use, and brought the heart of his home back to life. He ate in silence, but with a look of profound gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. She saw a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm, and, remembering how her father had taught her to mend things on their farm, she went out to help him. He showed her how to stretch the wire taut while he secured it to the posts. They worked side by side, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same tool, sending a jolt through Eliza that was sharper than any splinter. They fell into an easy rhythm, a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. Together, they repaired a leak in the stable roof, their movements synchronized as he worked on the shingles above and she passed him tools from the ladder below. They weeded Mary's garden, their fingers digging into the same cool, dark earth, tending to the legacy of the woman who was both a ghost and a blessing between them. In these shared tasks, they learned the language of each other's movements, the comfortable cadence of a shared silence. They spoke of small things, the weather, the stubbornness of a particular calf, the best way to preserve green beans. They were building a life in miniature, one repaired fence post, one shared meal at a time, carefully avoiding the larger, more dangerous topics of their pasts and their future. One afternoon, the heat was a physical presence, a thick, shimmering blanket that lay heavy on the land. The sun beat down with a relentless, white-hot intensity. They were reinforcing the wall of the old stable, replacing a section of logs that had begun to rot. Luke was using a broadaxe to shape a new log, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing in the still air. Eliza was clearing away the old, punky wood when a splintered section of the wall gave way unexpectedly. A heavy piece of timber, rotted and heavier than it looked, struck Luke on the shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a sharp grunt of pain. "Luke!" she cried, rushing to his side. "I'm all right," he gritted out, but his face was pale beneath his tan, and he was holding his left shoulder, his arm hanging limply at his side. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice firm. He hesitated, then gave a curt nod. In the shade of the stable, she gently helped him ease his canvas shirt off his shoulders. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the first time she had seen him so unguarded. His skin was tanned and weathered from the sun, stretched taut over the hard muscle of his back and chest. A long, faded scar ran diagonally across his ribs, a testament to some past, forgotten violence. The injury was a nasty scrape along the top of his shoulder, already beginning to swell and ooze blood where the rough wood had torn the skin. "It needs cleaning," she said, her voice a little breathless. She fetched the water bucket and a clean rag from the house. Her hands trembled as she dipped the rag into the cool water and wrung it out. He stood perfectly still, his back to her, his breathing slow and even. When her fingers, wrapped in the damp cloth, made contact with his skin, a shock went through them both. His muscles flinched and tightened under her touch. Her own skin burned as if she had touched a hot iron. It was the most intimate contact she had ever had with him, an act of care that felt impossibly, terrifyingly bold. She cleaned the wound with meticulous care, her touch as light as she could make it. She was aware of everything, the warmth of his skin, the fine, dark hairs on his arms, the solid, living strength of him. It was an uncharted territory, the intimate geography of a man who was not her husband, and the discovery was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Each dab of the cloth was a question, each pass a discovery. When she finished, she found an old, clean shirt of his and helped him put it on, her fingers brushing against his chest. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it left a searing brand on her memory. He turned to face her, his gray eyes dark and intense. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice husky. She could only nod, unable to find her voice, her heart thrumming a wild, chaotic rhythm in her chest. A week later, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. They had been working all day, trying to get the last of the hay into the barn before the weather turned. The air was thick and heavy, and the first drops of rain began to fall just as Luke swung the heavy barn doors shut. The rain came suddenly, not as a drizzle, but as a torrential downpour, drumming a deafening tattoo on the tin roof. The world outside the barn dissolved into a churning, gray chaos. "We'll have to wait it out," Luke said, his voice raised over the roar of the storm. To escape the dust and the drafts on the main floor, they climbed the ladder to the hayloft. The air up there was warm and smelled sweetly of dried alfalfa and clover. Light filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls in long, dusty shafts, illuminating the space with a dim, golden glow, like the inside of a cathedral. The roar of the rain was softer here, a constant, soothing drumming that insulated them from the outside world. They sat on a bale of hay, not touching, but the small space made them intensely aware of each other. Eliza could feel the heat from his body, could hear the soft sound of his breathing over the rhythm of the rain. The air grew thick with all the things they had left unsaid. She shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the motes of dust dancing in a stray sunbeam. She felt his gaze on her, and when she finally dared to look at him, his expression was one of such raw, tender longing that it stole her breath. Slowly, as if afraid a sudden movement might break the fragile spell, he reached out and gently took her hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, but his touch was incredibly soft. He didn't pull her closer or make any other move. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it in a small, comforting circle. It was a question, a plea, a quiet request for permission to cross the final, invisible line that separated them. A tremor ran through her. Every instinct of propriety, every vow she had made to the memory of her husband, screamed at her to pull away. But her heart, the heart she had guarded for so long, yearned for this simple human connection. She looked from their joined hands to his face, and in the depths of his gray eyes, she saw her own loneliness reflected back at her. She slowly uncurled her fingers and laced them with his. It was her answer. He leaned toward her, his movements deliberate, giving her every chance to retreat. He lifted his other hand and gently cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. The tension in the small space was almost unbearable, a mixture of terror and a longing so profound it was a physical ache. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that began with a soft, tentative question, a gentle exploration. It tasted of rain and dust and a sorrow so deep it had no words. Eliza, who had only ever been kissed by one man, felt a lifetime of fear and loneliness melt away in that single, hesitant touch. Then, as she leaned into him, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, the kiss deepened. It became a release, a floodgate opening on months of unspoken words, shared glances, and silent afternoons. It was gentle and demanding, a question and an answer, a beginning and a homecoming. In the warm, hay-scented dimness of the loft, with a storm raging outside, Eliza Cunningham was no longer just a widow. She was a woman, alive and trembling, on the verge of a new and terrifying love. That first kiss in the hayloft did not shatter the world, but it quietly, irrevocably remade it. It was a secret covenant made in the warm, dusty dark, a promise sealed against the backdrop of a prairie storm. In the days that followed, Eliza continued her walks to Luke's ranch, but a new, invisible current now flowed between them, a silent language of shared glances, brief, deliberate touches, and smiles that were meant for no one else. Their relationship existed in a bubble, a sun-drenched, self-contained world bounded by the fences of his property. It was a life built of small, stolen intimacies. It was the way he would look up from his work when he heard her footsteps, and the hard lines of his face would soften. It was the way she would set a glass of cool water on the porch railing for him, her fingers lingering for a moment where his would soon be. It was in the brushing of their shoulders as they worked together in the stable, a contact that was no longer accidental, a silent acknowledgement that sent a jolt of warmth through them both. They learned the topography of each other's hearts not through grand declarations, but through these quiet offerings. She learned he had a dry, understated sense of humor that only appeared when they were alone. He learned she had a fierce, intelligent curiosity about the world, a mind that had been starved for conversation. They would talk for hours while they worked, their topics meandering from the practicalities of ranching to the shapes of clouds in the vast western sky. For Eliza, it was like breathing fresh, clean air after being locked in a stuffy room for years. But as the days shortened and the golden light of late summer bled into the crisp, melancholic air of autumn, the walls of their secret world began to feel thin and fragile. The town of redemption, though miles away, was a constant, unseen presence. Every time Eliza made the walk back to her shack as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple, the fear would creep back in. She would leave the warmth and easy companionship of Luke's world and re-enter the one where she was the troublemaking widow, a pariah whose every move was scrutinized. The conflict tore at her. With Luke, she felt more alive, more herself, than she ever had. He saw her not as a tragic figure or a fallen woman, but simply as Eliza. He listened to her opinions, valued her help, and looked at her with an open, honest desire that made her feel beautiful. But with this burgeoning happiness came a profound and terrible guilt. At night, alone in her cold cot, the ghost of her first husband would visit her. Thomas had been a good, kind man, and she had loved him with the simple, unquestioning love of a young bride. To feel this new, more turbulent and passionate emotion for Luke felt like a betrayal of that gentle memory. Society, her in-laws, the preacher's sermons. They had all taught her that a good woman's heart was buried with her husband. To love again was not just improper, it was a kind of faithlessness. Worse than the guilt was the deep-seated belief that she did not deserve this happiness. The world had taken Thomas from her, and his family had cast her out. She had internalized their judgment, believing on some fundamental level that she was flawed, a woman destined for loss. This happiness with Luke felt like a temporary reprieve, a beautiful, sunlit moment before the inevitable storm. She found herself waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this fragile joy to be snatched away as cruelly as her first life had been. Luke, with his quiet, watchful nature, saw the change in her. He saw the way she would sometimes pull away after a shared laugh, her expression clouding over. He noticed the new tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes would sometimes fill with a distant, haunted sadness. He confronted her one evening as she was preparing to leave. The sun was setting, bleeding fire across the horizon, and the chill of the coming night was in the air. She was wrapping her shawl around herself, her movements jerky and anxious. "You're 1,000 miles away," he said, his voice gentle. Eliza flinched, keeping her back to him. "I'm just tired. It's a long walk." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "It's more than that. The last few days, you've been building your walls back up. I thought we'd knock those down." A sob caught in her throat. She turned to face him, her face a mask of anguish. "We can't. Luke, don't you see? This is wrong. I'm a widow. You're a widower. We're both damaged. People are talking. They look at me like I'm some kind of harlot, and they look at you like you're a fool." "To hell with them," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. "We can't just say that," she cried, her voice cracking. "This is the world we live in. I can't bring this shame on you, and I can't bear to lose everything again. It's better to have nothing than to have something that will just be taken away." She was trembling, the words she had kept locked inside for so long pouring out of her. I'm not whole. Luke, I'm broken. You deserve someone better, someone perfect." He reached out and took her by the shoulders, his grip firm but gentle, forcing her to meet his gaze. His gray eyes were intense, burning with an emotion that silenced her. "Look at me, Eliza," he commanded softly. "I lived in a perfect house that was empty. I had a perfect life that was a ghost story. I don't need perfect." He shook his head, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. "Perfect is a lie people tell themselves in church. Out here, there's just surviving. There's just getting through to the next sunrise." His gaze softened, his hands sliding from her shoulders to cup her face. "I don't need a perfect woman," he whispered, his voice thick with sincerity. "I just need you to stay." His words struck a chord deep within her, a clear, ringing note of truth that cut through the cacophony of her fears. He wasn't asking her to be a saint or a memory. He was asking her to be human, to be present, to be his. Tears streamed down her face, and he gently wiped them away with his thumbs before kissing her, a kiss that was not passionate, but was a deep, reassuring promise. But her body, worn down by months of poor nutrition, hard labor, and emotional turmoil, was more fragile than her spirit. A few nights later, a cold, biting rain swept across the prairie. Eliza was caught in it on her long walk home. She arrived at her shack soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. By morning, the shivering had turned into a raging fever. The world dissolved into a confusing, terrifying blur of heat and chills. She was too weak to get up for water, too delirious to even call for help. She drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a fever dream where her shack was a ship tossing on a stormy sea, and the faces of Thomas and her father-in-law swirled in the darkness. 2 days passed. At his ranch, Luke was consumed by a gnawing worry. She hadn't come. It wasn't like her. On the 3rd morning, unable to bear the anxiety any longer, he saddled his horse and rode toward her shack, a cold dread coiling in his gut. He found her near death. She was curled in a tight ball on her cot, her skin flushed and burning to the touch, her breathing shallow and ragged. The air in the shack was stifling and smelled of sickness. Without a moment's hesitation, he wrapped her in her patched quilt, lifted her into his arms, and carried her out into the clean, cold air. He rode back to his ranch as fast as he dared, her head lolling against his chest, her feverish murmurs nonsensical against the steady beat of his heart. Back in the warmth of his cabin, he worked with a focused intensity. He stripped off her damp, sweat-soaked clothes and dressed her in another of his soft flannel shirts. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, trying to bring the fever down. He forced sips of broth and water between her cracked lips, willing her to live with every ounce of his being. For 2 days and nights, he did not leave her side. He sat in the chair by the bed, dozing fitfully, his hand always on her forehead or holding her hand, a physical anchor to keep her from drifting away. On the second night, the fever was at its worst. She began to thrash in the bed, her eyes wide and unseeing, lost in the depths of her delirium. She was crying out, calling Thomas's name, then begging her father-in-law for forgiveness. Luke's heart broke as he listened to the raw pain pouring out of her. He sat on the edge of the bed and gathered her into his arms, holding her against his chest, rocking her gently and murmuring soothing words, telling her she was safe, that he was there. Her thrashing subsided, and she grew quiet, her body still burning against his. She turned her face into his chest, her breathing still labored. In the deep quiet of the night, with only the sound of the wind outside, she spoke in a voice that was terrifyingly clear, a whisper from the soul. "If I die," she murmured, her words slurring slightly, "at least I was loved again." The words struck Luke with the force of a physical blow. It was the purest, most unguarded confession he had ever heard. It was the truth of her heart, spoken from a place beyond fear or pride. He realized then the depth of her struggle, the weight of the guilt she carried, and the incredible, terrifying courage it had taken for her to love him. A fierce, protective love surged through him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He would not let her die. He would not lose this, too. The fire had burned low, and a deep chill was creeping into the room. He knew he couldn't leave her to add more wood. Her fevered skin was hot, but her limbs were cold. Making a decision that defied all convention but felt like the only right thing in the world. He lay down on the bed beside her, on top of the covers, and carefully pulled her against his side. He wrapped his arms around her, sharing his own body heat, cocooning her in his strength. He was acutely aware of her fragility, of the soft press of her body against his. But his embrace was entirely protective. There was no passion in it, only a desperate, tender need to keep her safe, to guard her life with his own. He rested his cheek against the top of her head and, for the first time in 3 years, did not feel alone in his own bed. Eliza surfaced from the fever as if from a great depth. The first thing she became aware of was a profound sense of peace. The terrifying dreams were gone. The burning heat and the bone-shaking chills had subsided. She was warm, and she was not alone. Her eyes fluttered open. The pale, gentle light of dawn was filtering through the window, filling the room with a soft, gray glow. Her head was pillowed on a man's arm, and a strong, steady heartbeat echoed beneath her ear. She was curled against Luke's side, his other arm wrapped securely around her waist. His body a solid, warm wall against her back. He was asleep, his face relaxed and younger in the soft light, his breathing deep and even. The fever had broken. She lay perfectly still, a sense of wonder and disbelief washing over her. She was in his arms, in his bed, and she had never felt so safe, so utterly cherished in her entire life. The fears and guilts that had tormented her for so long seemed like distant, shadowy things in the clarity of this new morning. There was no shame, no sense of impropriety. There was only the quiet, undeniable truth of their closeness, the steady rhythm of his heart, and the peaceful dawn of a new day. She closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in a moment of pure, unadulterated peace, and surrendered to the feeling of being, finally, home. The peaceful dawn that followed the breaking of Eliza's fever was a fragile truce, a brief moment of quiet harbor before the inevitable storm. For a week, Eliza slowly regained her strength under Luke's tender, unwavering care. The unspoken truth of his love was in every bowl of broth he brought her, every log he added to the fire to keep her warm. Every time his hand would linger on her shoulder, the cabin became their entire world. And in this small, safe space, Eliza allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that a future was possible. But the world outside had not forgotten them. Gossip, carried by a lone rider or a traveler on the main track, had finally reached the ears of those Eliza feared most. The intrusion came on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the air was sharp with the scent of pine. Luke was out checking on a newborn calf, and Eliza was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. When she saw the buggy approaching, it was a severe, black-lacquered vehicle, pulled by a matching pair of black horses, and it moved with an air of grim purpose that made a knot of ice form in her stomach. She knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was before the driver even pulled the horses to a halt. Josiah Cunningham climbed down from the buggy. He was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in a severe black suit that was out of place in the wildness of the prairie. His face, framed by graying sideburns, was a mask of cold fury, his eyes the color of chipped slate. He was the man who had cast her out, the living embodiment of the judgment she had fled. He strode toward the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel, his gaze sweeping over her with open contempt. He took in her presence on Luke's porch, the man's blanket wrapped around her, and his thin lips tightened into a snarl. "So, it is true," he said, his voice a low, venomous thing. "The harlot plays house with her new protector." Eliza flinched as if struck. She rose unsteadily to her feet, clutching the blanket around her like a shield. "Mr. Cunningham, this is not what you think." "Do not insult my intelligence, girl," he snapped, stopping at the foot of the porch steps, forcing her to look down on him. "The whole territory is buzzing with your shame. You dishonor my son's memory. Did his name mean so little to you that you would throw yourself into the arms of the first brute who offered you shelter?" "He saved my life," Eliza whispered, her voice trembling. "He has ruined you." Josiah's voice rose to a righteous bellow. "He has taken what was left of your reputation and dragged it through the mud. A good woman, a proper widow, would have died in that storm before accepting this charity." At that moment, Luke rode back into the yard. He saw the black buggy, saw Josiah Cunningham standing at the foot of his porch, and saw the terror on Eliza's face. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his expression hardening into a dangerous calm. "This is private property," Luke said, his voice low and even, but with an undercurrent of steel. "State your business and be on your way." Josiah turned his furious gaze on Luke. "My business is with this woman. She is the widow of my son, and her conduct is a stain upon my family's name. I have come to take her back." Eliza's head snapped up. "Take me back? Back to what? You threw me out with nothing!" "Silence," Josiah roared. "You will be returned to my house, where you will live in penitence and prayer for the rest of your days, to atone for this sin." He then pointed a long, bony finger at Luke. "And as for you, sir, you will be hearing from my lawyer. There are laws against corrupting the virtue of a respectable woman. I will see you ruined. I will take this land, these cattle, everything you have, as payment for the damage you have done." The threat hung in the cold, clear air. Eliza looked at Luke and saw the life he had painstakingly built, the sturdy cabin, the well-kept barn, the small, healthy herd. She saw the years of hard labor, the sweat and the sacrifice, and she saw how this man, her cruel father-in-law, could use the law like a club to beat it all into dust. Using her as the reason, the love she felt for Luke, which had been a source of warmth and life, suddenly felt like a poison, a curse she had brought to his door. Luke took a step forward, his hands clenched. "You'll do nothing of the sort. Eliza stays here, with me, and if you ever set foot on this land again, I'll—" "No!" Eliza's voice cut through the tension, sharp and desperate. She looked at Josiah, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a new, terrible resolve. "I will go with you." Luke stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and hurt. "Eliza, what are you saying?" "It is what's proper," she said, the words tasting like acid. She turned to her father-in-law. "Just give me a day. I need to gather my things from my home." It was a lie, a desperate bid for a few hours of freedom. Josiah studied her. His eyes narrowed. He saw the fight go out of her, saw her surrender, and it pleased him. "One day," he decreed, "I will be in redemption tomorrow at noon. If you are not there, I will return with the sheriff." He gave Luke one last look of pure hatred, then climbed back into his buggy and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a shattered silence in his wake. The moment he was gone, Luke turned to her, his face etched with pain and confusion. "Eliza, you can't. We'll fight him. I don't care what he says, what anyone says." "He will ruin you." "Luke," she cried, tears finally breaking free. "And it will be my fault. Everything he said is true. I am a stain. I bring trouble wherever I go. I brought it to Thomas, and now I've brought it to you." "That's not true." "It is," she insisted, backing away from him, away from the comfort of his touch. "I can't let you lose everything because of me. I won't." She was inconsolable. She retreated into a shell of misery, refusing to listen to his pleas, his reassurances. That night, she lay awake, staring into the darkness, the weight of her decision crushing her. To protect him, she had to destroy them. It was the only way. Before the sun rose, while Luke was in a deep, exhausted sleep, she slipped out of the bed. She found a piece of paper and a nub of charcoal, and, by the faint light of the dying embers in the hearth, she wrote, "My dearest Luke, please forgive me. Mr. Cunningham is right. I cannot be the cause of your ruin. You have worked too hard and built too much to see it all destroyed by scandal. I do not want you to carry the shame of being associated with a woman like me. Thank you for showing me what it feels like to be safe. It is a memory I will cherish. Do not come after me. Forget me. Yours, Eliza." She left the note on the pillow where her head had lain. She dressed in the old, mended clothes he had saved for her and took nothing else, with one last heartbreaking look at his sleeping form. She slipped out of the cabin and into the pre-dawn chill. She did not go toward town. She went back to the only other place she had, the derelict shack at the edge of the Badlands. When Luke woke to an empty bed and found her note, a rage unlike any he had ever known seized him. It was a cold, desolate fury, directed not at her, but at the world that had cornered her, at the father-in-law who had broken her, and at his own helplessness. He tore the note in his fist, a raw, guttural cry of anguish echoing in the empty cabin. In the days that followed, he let his world fall apart. The newborn calf went untended. The fences remained unmended. The harvest, the culmination of a season's hard work, rotted in the fields. He rode the boundaries of his property like a caged animal, fueled by whiskey and a grief so profound it felt like a physical illness. He was a man adrift, his anchor gone, and he let himself be consumed by the storm. A week passed, the weather turned dry, and a hot, arid wind blew in from the south, sucking the last of the moisture from the land. The prairie grass, cured by the autumn sun, became a field of tinder. The fire started in the middle of the night, sparked by a stray lightning strike from a storm with no rain. It began as a small, hungry thing, but the wind fed it, nurtured it, and it grew with terrifying speed into a roaring, unstoppable monster. Luke was slumped in a chair by his cold hearth, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. When he first smelled it, a sharp, acrid scent on the wind, he went to the door and looked out. The northern horizon was no longer black, but glowed with a sickening, vibrant orange. The wind carried the distant, terrible roar of a consuming fire, and it was heading directly toward the Badlands, toward her shack. The whiskey, the grief, the anger, it all burned away in a single, clarifying blast of pure terror. Eliza. He moved without thinking. He grabbed his saddle, a canteen of water, and a wet burlap sack. He threw open the corral gate, and his horse, Zeus, galloped out, sensing the urgency and the danger. He saddled the animal with frantic, shaking hands and vaulted onto its back. He dug his heels in, and the horse launched into a desperate, flat-out gallop toward the inferno. The world became a nightmare of smoke and heat. The air was thick and choked with ash, making every breath a painful, searing gasp. Embers, carried by the wind like demonic fireflies, rained down around him, setting small spot fires that grew and merged with the main blaze. The roar was deafening now, a constant, hungry thunder. He found the shack ringed by a wall of flame. The fire had already consumed the dry grass around it and was beginning to lick at the old, tinder-dry wood of the walls.
"Eliza!"
he screamed, his voice raw and torn by the smoke.
"Eliza!"
He leaped from his horse, wrapping the wet sack around his head and shoulders, and plunged through the curtain of heat and smoke. Inside, the shack was an oven. The air was thick and black. Through the swirling smoke, he saw her. She was on the floor, crawling, disoriented, not toward the door, but toward the corner where her cot was. He grabbed her, pulling her up. "We have to go, now!" "My mother's locket," she choked out, coughing, pointing toward the cot. "It's all I have left." "There's no time," he roared. He didn't wait for an argument. He scooped her up, throwing her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, and charged back toward the doorway just as a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame. He burst back out into the night, his lungs burning, his skin scorched, and ran until they were clear of the immediate danger, collapsing to the ground 100 yards away. He lay her down gently, and they both coughed and gasped, trying to pull clean air into their tortured lungs. The shack behind them was fully engulfed, a roaring pyre against the black sky. When she could finally breathe, Eliza pushed herself up and looked at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You could have been killed." "You think I would have just let you burn?" he yelled, the terror and adrenaline and rage of the past week finally exploding out of him. "I left to protect you," she cried, her voice rising to match his. "From the scandal, from my father-in-law, so you wouldn't lose everything." He surged to his feet and stood over her, his chest heaving, his face a mask of raw, ragged anguish in the flickering firelight. Tears streamed down his own soot-stained cheeks, mixing with the sweat and ash. "My reputation," he screamed, his voice breaking with the sheer force of his emotion. "You ran into a fire for a locket, and you left me for my reputation?" He threw his arms wide, gesturing wildly at the burning world around them, at himself, at her. "You think I care more about my reputation than your life?" Luke's question, raw and ragged in the smoke-filled air, was not a question at all. It was the truth of his heart, laid bare at her feet amidst the ashes of her old life. It was an accusation against her fear, and a declaration of a love so fierce it would walk through fire. The fight, the pride, the carefully constructed walls of propriety she had hidden behind for so long, it all crumbled into dust inside her. In the flickering, hellish light of the fire, she saw him not as a cowboy, a rescuer, or a potential source of scandal, but as the very anchor of her world. He was the man who had pulled her from the mud, tended her wounds, sat with her in the dark, and now had risked his life to pull her from the flames. His reputation, his land, his cattle, they were meaningless next to the simple, terrifying, glorious fact that he was here, and he had come for her. She didn't answer with words. She couldn't. She simply collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs that were not of sorrow, but of a profound, soul-shattering release. He held her, his arms a circle of strength in the chaos, and buried his face in her smoke-scented hair. The prairie burned around them, but in that moment, they were the only two people on earth. The journey back to his ranch was a somber, silent pilgrimage. He had retrieved Zeus from where the terrified horse had bolted, and he placed Eliza carefully in the saddle before swinging up behind her. She leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, exhausted and empty, and let his strength carry her home. Her shack was gone. Her meager possessions were gone. The last physical remnants of her life with Thomas, of the woman she had been, were nothing but ash on the wind. There was nothing to go back to. There was only forward. When they arrived at his cabin, he slid from the horse and lifted her down as if she were made of spun glass. Inside, he did not lead her to a guest chair or the bed. He led her to the wash basin, gently cleaned the soot from her face and hands with a soft, damp cloth, and tended to the small burns on her arms. His every touch was a vow. When he was done, she did not retreat to a separate corner. She simply sat at his table, in his home, and watched him move. A quiet sense of permanence settling over her for the first time. The decision had been made in the heart of the fire. She was staying. Their new life together began not with a celebration, but with a quiet, mutual defiance. Eliza moved her existence into the small spaces of his cabin. It was an unspoken arrangement. There was no discussion of marriage, no talk of the future. There was only the present, a shared reality forged in crisis. They were two solitary people who had decided to be solitary together. The world outside, however, was not content to leave them to their peace. The news of the fire, of Eliza's rescue, and of her subsequent move into Luke Calder's home spread through Redemption like a disease. It confirmed every suspicion, every malicious whisper. She was no longer just the troublemaking widow. She was the fallen woman, a kept woman, living in sin with the wild hermit from the hills. The shunning was immediate and absolute. When Luke went to town for supplies, men who had once shared a drink with him would turn their backs. Mr. Henderson at the general store sold him what he needed, but his manner was cold, his words clipped, his eyes refusing to meet Luke's. The prices, Luke noted with a grim tightening of his jaw, had suddenly gone up. Eliza tried once to reclaim a piece of her old life. She walked into town, hoping to find some mending work, some small way to contribute. The doors that had once been open to her were now closed. Mrs. Gable, seeing her approach, shut her front door with a sharp, definitive click. Other women simply shook their heads and whispered, "No work today," through a crack in the door. She was an outcast, a contagion they feared would taint their own respectable lives. She walked back to the ranch that day with an empty basket and a heavy heart, and never went to town again. The cruelty escalated. One morning, Luke went out to the pasture and found one of his best heifers lying dead by the creek, its belly bloated, white foam frothing at its mouth. He knelt beside the animal, his face a mask of cold, hard fury. It was poison, a quiet, cowardly act of malice meant to cripple him, to drive them out. He carried the dead animal back on a sledge, and they buried it together at the edge of the property. They didn't speak as they worked, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel the only sound. It was a grim, heartbreaking task, and as they filled the grave, they were burying more than just a cow. They were burying any lingering hope that the world would leave them be. They were alone, truly alone, in a siege of their own making. But the siege, instead of breaking them, forged them into something stronger. Their shared isolation became a bond thicker than blood. The silence of the town was replaced by the richness of their own quiet companionship. They became a self-contained unit, relying on nothing and no one but each other. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their shared labor a silent testament to their resilience. They repaired the fences, tended the remaining cattle, and harvested what was left of the season's crops. Their life in the cabin fell into a simple, intimate rhythm. They moved around each other with an economy of motion born of familiarity, their bodies learning a silent dance in the small space. He learned that she liked her coffee with a little sugar, and she learned that he always fell asleep on his left side. These small, mundane details were the bricks with which they built their fortress. The world could rage outside, but within the sturdy log walls of the cabin, they had peace. The first snow of the season came early that year, a soft, white blanket that covered the scorched earth and muffled the world in a profound quiet. The isolation was complete now. The cold sealed them in, cutting them off from the hostile town and leaving them entirely to themselves. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, Luke did something different. Instead of their usual simple meal of beans and bacon, he spent the afternoon carefully roasting a piece of venison he had shot a few days prior. He filled the cabin with the rich, savory smell of herbs and roasting meat. He brought out 2 tin plates and set them on the small table, not with their usual perfunctory clatter, but with a deliberate, gentle care. He lit the oil lamp, keeping the wick low so that it cast a soft, golden glow, pushing the dark, lonely corners of the room into shadow. When Eliza came in from feeding the chickens, her cheeks pink from the cold, she stopped in the doorway. Surprised by the scene, the cabin felt different, warmer, softer. It felt less like a shelter and more like a sanctuary. After they ate, speaking in low tones while the wind raged its impotent fury against the walls, Luke did something else. He took the thickest, softest wool blanket he owned and spread it on the floor before the hearth. He added another log to the fire, sending a shower of bright, dancing sparks up the chimney. He sat down on the blanket, his back against a rolled-up saddle, and looked at her, his expression an open, gentle invitation. Gentle. Eliza's heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm. This was not an ordinary night. This was a threshold. The air was thick with a significance that was both terrifying and deeply longed for. All the unspoken feelings, all the shared glances and lingering touches of the past weeks had led to this single, quiet moment. She hesitated, her old fears and insecurities rising like ghosts. She was a ruined woman, a burden. She was not worthy of this tenderness, this peace. She thought of Mary, the woman for whom this house had been built, whose presence was a faint, lavender-scented memory in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She could never take her place. As if sensing her thoughts, Luke spoke, his voice a low rumble that was a counterpoint to the howling wind. "You're not a ghost in this house, Eliza. You're the life in it." His words were the final key, unlocking the last bolted door in her heart. She turned and walked to the cedar chest. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, folded neatly, were Mary's things. Eliza reached in and drew out a simple dress of dark blue wool, a dress she had seen once before when looking for spare linen. It was well made and plain, the dress of a practical, loving woman. She retreated to the small, curtained-off corner of the room that served as her private space. When she returned, she was no longer wearing her own patched and faded calico. She was wearing Mary's dress. It fit as if it were made for her. It was not an act of replacement, but an act of acceptance. She was accepting his past, his grief, and his home, and claiming it as her own. Luke watched her approach the fire, his eyes wide with a profound, aching tenderness. She walked into the warm circle of light and knelt on the blanket before him. She looked into his eyes, her own gaze clear and steady. All the fear and doubt finally burned away. "Tonight," she whispered, her voice clear and strong in the quiet room, "I'm not afraid anymore." He reached out and cupped her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her cheeks as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, he drew her forward, and their lips met, a kiss that was not like the desperate, rain-soaked kiss in the hayloft, but was a slow, deep, and certain homecoming. He laid her back gently on the soft wool, and the firelight played over them, casting their shadows, now joined as one, in a dancing silhouette against the log wall. This was not the hurried, fumbling union of youthful passion, but something far deeper, a deliberate, sacred act of 2 scarred and lonely souls finding solace. His hands, which she had only known to be strong and capable with rope and wood and iron, were now impossibly tender as they unfastened the buttons of the blue wool dress. His touch on her skin was not a claim of ownership. but a question, a reverence. And her response was a complete and total surrender, not of her will, but of her fear. For Eliza, who had known only the dutiful, gentle affection of her first husband, this was a revelation. This was a love born of hardship, a passion forged in fire. It was in the desperate, hungry way he kissed her, as if he were a starving man and she was his first feast. It was in the tremor she felt run through his powerful body when she tentatively reached up and touched the rough scar on his ribs, accepting the history of his pain. For Luke, who had known the comfortable love of a wife and the bitter emptiness of her loss, this was a rebirth. To feel Eliza's soft, willing body beneath his, to hear the soft sigh escape her lips as he rediscovered the forgotten language of intimacy, was to feel his own frozen heart finally, painfully, begin to thaw. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. It was the pain of old wounds being soothed by a tender touch. It was the ache of a profound, long-denied hunger finally being sated. It was the fierce, protective tenderness in his eyes, and the radiant, trusting vulnerability in hers. It was a silent conversation where every touch, every kiss, every whispered breath said the same thing. You are not alone. I am here. You are safe. As the fire burned down to glowing, watchful embers and the wind outside finally wept itself into a weary silence. They came together, two halves of a single, broken whole, finding in each other a healing more profound than they had ever dared to imagine. It was not a night of sin, as the world would have called it. It was a night of grace. The fire that had consumed Eliza's past became a crucible, forging a new future for them both. The year that followed was not easy, but it was real. They had stepped through the flames and emerged on the other side, bound by a love that was as tough and resilient as the prairie grass that grew back, green and defiant, from the scorched earth. Winter sealed them in, and in that quiet, snowbound world, their love deepened into a profound, unshakable partnership. When the spring thaw came, it was not just the land that felt new. A subtle but undeniable change was happening within Eliza. A new life was taking root, a tiny, miraculous consequence of a love the world had condemned. When she told Luke, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and fierce joy, he did not speak. He simply went to his knees before her, laid his head in her lap, and his broad shoulders shook with a single, silent sob of gratitude. This child was not a mark of their shame, but a testament to their survival. It was a promise. From that day forward, Luke worked with a renewed, almost feverish purpose. He was no longer just a man surviving on his land. He was a man building a kingdom for his family. He spent weeks hewing new logs, and with Eliza directing him from a chair on the porch, he began to build a new room onto the side of the cabin. It was slow, back-breaking work, but every swing of the axe, every perfectly notched log set into place, was an act of love. He was building a nursery. He was building a home. The town of Redemption watched from a distance, the hard-hearted core, the gables, the cronies of Jebediah stone, remained as cold and unforgiving as a winter stone. But on the fringes, a slow thaw began. Men who respected hard work above all else, like the town blacksmith, would watch Luke drive his wagon past, loaded with fresh-cut timber, and a grudging respect would flicker in their eyes. They might not approve of his methods, but they could not deny his industry. The women, too, began to see things differently. They saw Eliza, her body swelling with new life, working beside Luke in Mary's old garden, her face glowing with a contentment that defied all their dire predictions of ruin and misery. Some of them, women who had known their own share of hardship, who had buried children and husbands in the unforgiving earth, began to see not a harlot, but a woman who had found love in a hopeless place. A few tentative smiles were offered, a quiet nod exchanged when Luke bought supplies. It was not acceptance. Not yet, but it was the beginning of a grudging tolerance. This fragile peace was shattered by the return of Josiah Cunningham. He had not forgotten his threat. He had merely been waiting, letting the law grind its slow, deliberate way west. The summons was delivered by the sheriff, a stoic man who looked deeply uncomfortable with his task. It accused Luke Calder of unlawful cohabitation and the moral corruption of a widow of good standing, and demanded their presence at an informal hearing to be held in 1 month's time, when the circuit judge was due in town. The stark black and white words on the paper threatened to undo everything. The old fear, which had been a quiet ghost in the back of Eliza's mind, returned with a vengeance. She saw Josiah's face, contorted with hate, and she saw him taking everything from Luke, just as he had threatened. But Luke would not let her despair. He took the summons from her trembling hands, read it once, and then calmly folded it and tucked it into his pocket. He looked at her, his gray eyes steady and clear. "He is a bitter old man trying to punish the world for his own misery," Luke said. "We will face him, together." The day of the hearing, the town saloon was packed. It was a grim, makeshift courtroom, smelling of stale beer and sawdust. The circuit judge, a weary-looking man named Patterson with a reputation for pragmatism, sat behind a rickety table, his face impassive. The whole town seemed to be there, their faces a sea of morbid curiosity. Josiah Cunningham stood before the judge, a Bible clutched in his hand, and delivered a speech full of fire and brimstone. He painted a picture of his innocent, grieving daughter-in-law, a lamb who had been led astray by a wolf. He spoke of his son's sacred memory, of the sanctity of marriage, of the moral fabric of their community being torn asunder by this flagrant display of sin. He was eloquent and convincing, and as he spoke, Eliza felt the weight of the town's judgment settle upon her once more. When it was Luke's turn, he did not make a speech. He stood tall and straight, his hands at his sides, and spoke in a voice that was clear and calm. "Your Honor," he said, "I am not a man of fancy words. All I know is this. I found Eliza Cunningham half dead in a storm. I took her in, I found her again in a fire, and I took her out. She was alone and grieving, and this town turned its back on her. I did not—" He turned and looked directly at Eliza, his love for her a palpable thing in the stuffy room. "I love her, and she is carrying my child. If that is a crime in the eyes of God or this territory, then I am guilty." A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Patterson looked from Luke's earnest face to Josiah's smug one, his expression unreadable. "This is a difficult matter," the judge began, steepling his fingers. "While the law values propriety, it also values life and liberty." It was then that a voice, frail but clear as a bell, spoke from the back of the room. "He's not telling you the whole truth." "Judge!" All heads turned. An elderly woman was slowly making her way to the front. It was Martha Gable, the doctor's widow, a woman whose opinion was the bedrock of the community. She was small and stooped with age, but her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. Even Josiah Cunningham looked momentarily taken aback. Martha stopped before the judge's table. "Josiah Cunningham speaks of his son's sacred memory," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I am the one who sat with his son as he died, and I am the one who watched this man and his wife cast this girl, Eliza, out of her own home less than a week after the funeral, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few dollars they threw at her like she was a beggar." A collective gasp went through the saloon. "I have watched this girl for the past year and a half," Martha continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, making people shift uncomfortably. "I watched her nearly starve in that old shack, taking in any sewing she could get, never asking for a lick of charity from anyone. And I've watched her these past months. I've seen her work alongside that man, seen the life come back into her eyes. I've seen him build a new room onto his house for the baby that's coming." She turned and fixed her sharp eyes on Josiah. "You speak of moral corruption. Josiah, But the greatest sin I see in this room is a father who would use his own grief as a weapon to destroy a young woman his son once loved. You did not come here to protect her honor. You came here because you cannot stand to see her happy." The silence in the room was absolute. Martha's words, spoken with the unassailable authority of age and wisdom, had completely dismantled Josiah's righteous crusade, revealing the bitter, vengeful heart beneath. Judge Patterson looked at Josiah, his eyes now cold. "Mr. Cunningham, it seems your case is built on a foundation of hypocrisy and ill will. This court finds no evidence of corruption or coercion." He banged a small gavel on the table. "Case dismissed. These two people are free to live as they see fit, as a voluntary union in the eyes of the law." It was over. Defeated and publicly shamed, Josiah Cunningham stalked out of the saloon, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. Luke took Eliza's hand, and together they walked out into the bright sunlight, no longer as outcasts, but as a family. That night, the air was cool and clean, and the sky was a vast blanket of black velvet, punctured by 1,000,000 diamond-bright stars. They sat on the porch of the home they had built and defended together, Eliza's head resting on Luke's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her and the new life she carried. The quiet of the prairie was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. Eliza looked up at the endless, star-dusted expanse, a sense of wonder filling her heart. "For the first time," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I feel like I'm not just living, but being loved." Luke tightened his embrace, pulling her closer. He kissed the top of her head, his heart full to bursting. He looked from her face to the sturdy cabin, to the new room that waited for their child, to the land that had tested them and finally blessed them. "And for the first time," he answered, his voice a low, contented rumble, "my heart has a home." The prairie wind, the same wind that had once spoken of desolation and hardship, sighed through the tall grass. It swept over the small ranch, no longer wild and untamed, but a gentle, promising whisper, as tender and enduring as the love they had fought the entire world to keep. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We love creating these tales for you and would be so grateful if you'd let us know in the comments where you're listening from. It's wonderful to see how far these stories travel. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories like this. And share your thoughts on Eliza and Luke's journey.